All right, thanks very much, Ryan, for the intro. I'm just going to do a very, very brief introduction and then let us get into the presentation. Again, I'm David Goldwater with Stantec. I lead our relationship with the National League of Cities as well as a number of other things for the firm. Stantec is a executive corporate partner with an LLC, and really wanted to take this opportunity to roll out and talk to you a little bit about a potentially extremely helpful tool that Stantec has just begun rolling out. Timing is a little interesting in the fact of where it fell as we rolled out this tool, but we know that right now, even more than ever, while this is a tool you can use forever, right now it's something that can be critical path for so many communities across the country. So with that, this financial analysis tool that Andy is going to talk through, we felt could be very helpful as you look at your financial impacts and planning through this very, very unusual situation, unprecedented situation. We know every community in the country and globally has been impacted, and want to provide an opportunity to talk through how we can help you look at some of the real-time impacts to how things are looking financially, as well as for some funding as it moves along. At the end of this, as Ryan said, we will open it up for questions so that we can talk through specifics, as well as have you provided with contact information where you can reach out to us if you want to set up a little more detailed discussion about this real-time financial analysis tool. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Burnham, let him kick things off, and then we'll go from there into the organization with Amy and some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So, hey everyone, as David said, my name is Andy Burnham. I'm the Financial Management Consulting Leader here at Stantec, and one of the things that David thought would be beneficial for us to share with the group are some tools and technology that we've been assisting other communities with to evaluate in the immediate term COVID-19 related financial impacts, and to understand those in real time, but then to also look at developing some options and solutions to offset some of those negative financial impacts. And so we thought a good way to have that conversation and to share some of that information would be through a demonstration of a community that's in Florida. The names and the numbers have been changed slightly to protect the innocent. But to go through and really show you a financial platform that they're using and we've been using with them to evaluate the impacts of COVID-19. So what we're looking at right now on the screen is kind of the control panel tab, if you will, where it shows for each year over a multi-year projection period what the operating millage rate is so this would be per $1,000 of taxable value. They're at 5.5 mils. What the taxable value growth assumptions are that they have in their baseline forecast that accounts for property value appreciation as well as new development. What the annual cash flow surplus is or deficit might be in a given year from all their sources and uses of funds. What their end of year fund balance is in millions of dollars as well. So you could see that they're trending at about $35 million on average for an end of year fund balance, and what that fund balance is as a percentage of their annual expenses. So they're tracking that all over time. And obviously their plan is consistent with many communities is to hold that millage rate flat. In ideal circumstances, potentially roll it back, but for as long as possible over a multi-year planning period. And we've shown some kind of key graphical inputs for the system over time. So you can see its end of year operating cash balance as compared to that target graphically that was presented up above. We've shown the annual summary of revenues and expenses, and we can actually go ahead and change the scale on this graph and maybe zoom in a little bit so we can see some of the detail a little bit better. And what you'll be able to see here is that there's some spikes in that expenditure curve each year where we saw some of those cash flow deficits emerge, and a lot of that's being caused by big spikes of capital spending. And I'll show you some of the capital improvement projects that they have in here as well that contribute to some of those spiky elements in their capital or in their expenditure profile. But within the tool, you can click on each of these points and get some of that drill down information. But perhaps more importantly, by way of background, this is a community that's very reliant on property tax revenue for the community. There also are other revenue sources, and we've included for this purpose some income tax revenues to show what the impacts of income tax reductions would be as well. And we've shown a summary of annual expenditures by type, and as with most communities in their general fund and their tax rates, they're really supporting a lot of personnel expenses, some O&M, as well as some other potential discretionary below the line expenses or debt service expenses. And so this is kind of the baseline forecast for this particular community. And what we have done is set up a number of inputs that we can control and evaluate what happens under certain sets of scenarios. And so these scenario inputs or saved inputs, you can develop a range of alternatives and quickly with button clicks look at some defined cases or even create defined cases of impacts. And so some of the things that were most relevant to this community were understanding alternative trajectories of sales tax, income tax, and gas tax revenues. And so if I go to a revenue summary here, any of these things could be changed over time in terms of assumptions. We developed a baseline forecast for this community, but they were interested in looking at some sensitivity analysis off of these baseline projections and wanted to look at potentially adjusting them. And you can do that by simply changing any of these dials. They could go up or potentially down, but we created some predefined scenarios. So for sales tax, we looked at a scenario of a reduction of about 30% in sales tax revenue for 2020. Even though they're feeling more of those impacts over the last 2 quarters of the year. The first 2 quarters of the year were relatively unaffected, and then a similar impact in 21, and then a gradual recovery in 22 and 23. And we developed a potential where maybe we only get to partial recovery, and you can see what that trajectory would look like versus the baseline of 100% assumptions. And so we can create these types of sensitivity ranges as we understand more and more what the extent of the impacts would be to our various revenue streams. So for sales tax, we could include, say, a baseline forecast of full recovery over a few years. Income tax is maybe a little bit more of an impact and could take a little bit longer to return to normal. Gas tax, from what we're seeing, is not as much as an impact to communities as, say, the sales and income tax thus far, but that information is still evolving. And so there we did a little bit more modest sensitivity analysis there of a reduction in revenues. But we could also come in and change certain things, like say the parks and recreations revenues are maybe diminished this year as well because of closing of some facilities, maybe our economic development revenues associated with various licenses, fees, and permits, maybe those are declining as well. And so we can make changes to all these revenue assumptions, come back to the control panel, and really evaluate the impacts. Since we're keeping a lot of the underlying millage rate information the same, the real impacts are going to be to these operating reserves. And so I'm going to focus the panel on that particular screen and update the model with those revenue impacts. And now what we're able to see are substantial impact to the community. What was a pretty healthy and stable trajectory for the status quo is now anything but, given the magnitude of these impacts to the short-term revenues. And so what we're seeing a lot of communities looking at are looking at doing things to try to combat these impacts. We looked at doing a salary freeze. And so if I go to, say, our expenditure summary and look at our profile for our O&M, or excuse me, our assumptions tab, to show you the impacts of changes in our forecast assumptions for, say, cost escalation factors. You know, some communities are looking at a pay freeze. And so if I go to the scenario here, we did a pay freeze in fiscal year 21 and then resumed with normal planned increases thereafter. And we could run that through to see how much would that impact our reserves. And you can see that actually had a pretty substantial impact that could be part of a solution, as it was for this community, to try to combat these preliminary estimates. So they're looking at a pay freeze. They're also looking at a deferred capital spending program. In the tool itself, we have a line item specific capital improvement program that can be adjusted. It has a number of different elements included on it. So if we go all the way up to the top of the tab, you'll see there's a city hall renovation that was planned in 22, a fire station that was coming up, partially grant funded in 23. They had a cultural center that was actually towards the end of the projection period out here in 2028. But they looked at a plan of deferring some capital adjustments, notably the City Hall renovation several years, the fire station, the cultural center. And so if I go back to the panel to see what happens with capital deferrals, to see if we can get closer to a sustainable trajectory with these impacts, recalculate the model, you'll now be able to see that our reserves are getting much closer to the target in the long term, but we still have some near-term challenges. And so unfortunately, what some communities are also looking at doing are potential programmatic adjustments to their spending, which in this case, we've got kind of a what if expense that we set up to say, what if we had a programmatic reduction of that we implemented partway through the year that was a $5 million of savings to the general fund. What would that do? And if we run that through, you'll be able to see pretty quickly that will get us much closer to a steady state trajectory on our reserve profile. And so if I scroll down, you can see now our reserves are back on track and actually exceeding our target. But the one thing that we haven't yet thought about in this forecast are potential impacts to taxable value. And so this is one of the things that's a little bit less of an immediate impact, but certainly on the horizon. And so we did some work with their tax assessor's office and also with their planning group to evaluate and understand the impacts of the rate of development and what could occur to develop some sensitivities around taxable value growth. In addition to our baseline, we looked at maybe at worst, what if we had a decline in taxable value with a slow return? Maybe a medium case would be just no increase in taxable value, but then very modest increases until we reached full recovery. And then a best case where it was just a blip for 2 years and then we return back to normal. So factoring in not necessarily just those immediate revenue impacts, but the longer term impacts, particularly to a system like this that's property tax dependent, was also an important part of the process. And so now you can see we're back to a situation where we could have long-term sustainability issues if those types of changes in taxable value were to occur, such that we may have to also look at a scenario of some reduced O&M spending overall, programmatically, not necessarily filling any vacancies, looking for other efficiencies to try to combat those potential impacts in order to have a long-term sustainable plan. So this is just really quickly showing you how this community has been able to use our financial analysis and management system tool, FAMS, to really quickly analyze the range of impacts to revenues, potential solutions relative to expenditure adjustments to try to offset those, to ultimately develop an alternative and viable plan. And so once we've gone through and defined all those elements, we could save this as potentially our first, COVID-19 response scenario. And the benefit of the FAM system is that as a community, you can have multiple users accessing the system at the same time, saving and running scenarios. It has version control, so that's never an issue, and you can share these scenarios with others. So if the city manager wants to share it with the finance director or a key department head, or even with elected officials, you can look at and share all these scenarios in real time as you're responding and reacting to new information. And so you can create that scenario. And once it's been created, you then have the ability to compare scenarios. So you can look at how this new scenario were to say compare against your baseline scenario side by side. And we can look at all those key indicators to see what was our reserve position before, what are we looking at now for reserves under any of these given scenarios, and how does our expenditure profile compare, in our revenue profiles. We're looking at lower operating expenses, deferred capital, so you'll see some reductions there on expenses, and also in some of your revenues. Obviously, the reductions there to income taxes, sales tax, even property tax in the long term. You can see all those things side by side in real time. One of the other things that the tool is helpful to do is for communities that have outstanding indebtedness, which was a concern for this community, was to understand and integrate the rating agency criteria relative to financially evaluating the health and stability of community general funds. And so we've established a number of key performance indicators that can be tracked. And this is a dashboard that can be customized for each individual user. So if I, as a user, said, I like these two graphs that show me my full taxable value per capita and my fund balance as a percentage of revenues, but I really want to make sure that I'm considering my general fund net results you can edit this page, add a key performance indicator that are predefined and customized for your system. And if this one is really important to me, I can also move it up to the top of the list so that it's the very first thing that I see on my dashboard when I get to this page. And when I'm all done making adjustments, I can simply go to the bottom, stop editing, and now go back up to the top of the page. And the very first thing I'll see are my general fund net results. So we have the ability to create customized key performance indicators. So as you build these scenarios, you can make sure that you're tracking all the KPIs or performance indicators that are relevant to you. And also when you do scenarios, you can see a list of all the detailed assumptions that are side by side in each scenario. So you know exactly what went into each of the different options that you're evaluating. Part of the process too includes making sure that as you've developed a scenario and you want to take those results and potentially do further analysis with them, or even potentially integrate them back into your budget system, you have the ability to export all the detailed underlying information in the financial forecasts, whether it's revenues, expenses, fund balances, any and all of these schedules, and they're all exported into a format that's in Excel, but that can be customized to match your enterprise system's import formats. Most communities work and develop budgets in Microsoft Excel. And so once we know those parameters, you know, we can set up to have the reports for the system be exported in a format that you could directly import them back into your standard enterprise systems for budgeting or projection purposes, or simply have them in a native Excel format such that you could be able to do additional off-sheet analysis with, say, the revenue information, or if you had things about fund balances that you wanted to dig into. All of these things are completely customizable for the interface. Similarly with data uploads, data can be updated to the system. You'd be notified when, we would be notified when a particular data set's been updated. The system would then incorporate it, and then you'd be notified when a new model has been updated with this information, and you'd be prompted for each of your scenarios to rerun those scenarios with the new model that reflects updated information to make sure that your results are reflecting the latest and greatest information as part of the process. So it's just been a pretty powerful application of our FAMS system lately, is to help communities really understand what their impacts or range of impacts are relative to COVID-19, particularly on the revenue side, and then to start exploring options on the cost containment side to try to combat those impacts, which are ever evolving, wide ranging from community to community, and make sure that they can have this information amongst all the decision makers and leaders and managers in a way that they can work with it and incorporate it into systems so that they can disseminate it and incorporate it into their decision making. I think one of the things too that's really important to consider, and we didn't put it into this particular model yet for this community, are assumptions relative to governmental assistance programs. I think that's going to be a key component that's going to evolve in terms of potential relief or stimulus funds for qualifying expenditures that could come in after the fact to maybe offset some of these impacts, or let alone exploring alternative grant and loan programs that could also be represent new or creative funding strategies to try to provide funds for capital expenses, particularly in instances where communities are simply unable to defer some of the core essential capital and renewal and replacement needs they have to just simply maintain the level of service in the community. And so with that, I'd like to maybe turn it over to you, Amy, to talk a little bit about what we're seeing on some of the COVID-19 funding options, and have a little bit broader discussion about what we're seeing too with communities about just general funding program assistance.
Thanks, Andy. So as Andy said, we use FAMS to identify vulnerabilities and opportunities and to test sensitivities and scenarios. And in doing that, we gain a firm grasp of gaps in what's available, what we can do, and what's needed. And this highlights the need for alternative or outside funding if we don't have enough capital to move forward critical activities and projects. So my team helps communities access this funding. And we've been pretty successful at it over the last several decades. We've helped clients secure over $4 billion in grant and loan programs, over $1 billion of which was obtained for clients recovering from responding to disasters. We've worked in over 200 different communities And we work with a lot of different funding programs at the federal, state, and local levels. We work across technical disciplines, across the United States, and like I said, across lots of different funding programs. And many of us, including myself, really expanded our work in this area in 2009 with the passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARA. And that was when the federal government created a lot of different funding opportunities during the recession in a constrained economy. And well, with coronavirus, we're not in exactly the same place today. It's still about, how do we use outside funding to better absorb impacts and bounce back as quickly as possible. And, we've built some lessons learned, in regards to the Recovery Act, certainly, but also working with hundreds of clients, not during the recession on lining up funding. And we've learned about identifying, positioning, applying for, and managing funding. So when it comes to coronavirus, we see the likely impacts to communities, and we feel like there are some ways that we can definitely help. So it's really about, as Andy was pointing out, understanding what you need and then what's available to you to fund responses, relief, and recovery. Right now, we're very actively tracking, aggregating, and analyzing government response actions and their impacts on our clients. We have a growing list of over 300 federal, state, tribal, and local actions that have been taken. That would include governors' executive orders and federal legislation. We really want to be ahead of what's coming. So we can see what's been signed. We can see what's moving. And we have active projects going where we're helping to set up systems to support and align with the funding that's out there, including, of course, documentation for reimbursements. But as with everything related to coronavirus, there are a lot of unknowns, especially when it comes to what will happen in the future. Right now, governments are really all about response and immediate relief to those hardest hit. The federal government passed 3 pieces of legislation to date, $8.3 billion to really mobilize a national response, $100 billion plus of initial funding to help small businesses and provide sick leave. And then there was the $2 trillion CARES Act. These are being referred to as the first 3 phases of coronavirus response at the federal level. 2 weeks ago now, there was quite a bit of talk about an infrastructure stimulus package. This at the time was thought to be included in the phase 4. Those preliminary conversations really were based loosely on a framework for an infrastructure bill that had been introduced by Democrats some months back and had been brought back into discussions on Capitol Hill. It was a $760 billion bill, and it included a lot of things that did not surprise the funding specialists in our group. Their infrastructure funding needs that have been quantified and articulated by numerous sources and presented through numerous lobbying organizations to the federal government. The infrastructure stimulus discussions were dropped when the scope and immediate impact of the virus was started to be recognized that it was going to require more relief and response. And so the federal government focused back on response and relief. Recovery, it's not going to go away. There is a widespread expectation that stimulus legislation, including infrastructure, is going to be picked back up in the near term. When is the big outstanding question? Congress is on recess this week, and most expect there will be a series of relief-related packages passed in the near term, probably pushing out an infrastructure bill. Whether that's a month out or not until the fall, it's really difficult to say. But we do see overarching themes that we think are consistent in what funding is available today and the funding that we're going to see come through follow-on packages at the federal level and also at the state level. So there is an inclination to use existing funding programs. These are the funding programs that our group taps very frequently for our municipal and public utility clients. in relation to disasters, but also just in general to move infrastructure projects and community development projects along. There's of course, an emphasis on quick response and streamlining administration. So they're trying to reduce the amount of work it takes to get and the amount of time it takes to get funding from the agencies to the individuals and the government entities that need it. So there's a bit of streamlining of the administration of these funds. And there is increased flexibility, certainly, in the way that the agencies, the funding programs are processing applications, because there's a recognition that, again, the money just needs to move quickly. And we think that this will carry forward into whatever stimulus funding comes through, because there's going to be a huge emphasis on economic recovery and bouncing back. So we've even heard talk of agencies, eliminating requirements like benefit cost analysis, and in order to expedite the processing of applications. The CARES Act has received a lot of attention, $2 trillion, significant amount of funding, huge amount of funding. In that piece of legislation, there were a few items that many that were directed at and can assist state and local government. I've just named a few of those here. And the top two, the Coronavirus Relief Fund is $150 billion to state and local governments. And this is related to expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19, allocated by population proportions. And this ties back a lot to what Andy was talking about in terms of your baseline, what your approved budget looked like in 2020, and how much you've deviated from that to fund what and in what ways. And so it's really meant to fill in those expenses, those unexpected and considerable expenses that have been incurred related to responding to coronavirus. There's a minimum amount per state of 1.25 billion, but 45% of all of that 150 billion goes to metropolitan areas with greater than 500,000 people. And so it's weighted to larger cities. The remainder of the money, we believe, is going to go into the states, and they can apply it to smaller communities and cities. But the guidelines on that funding have not come out. The deadline for submitting certifications to the Treasury Department is this Friday, April 17th at midnight. We'll get more information on that funding shortly, I imagine. Then also the Disaster Relief Fund. This was the money for FEMA's Public Assistance Category B. That's really emergency response. It's emergency medical care, medical sheltering, and movement of supplies and persons and so forth related to immediate disaster recovery. And in the case of that funding and all of the funding, there are certain things you can do today that can help you access as much of that money as you're eligible for. So knowing your baseline, certainly seeing what and where you've deviated, how and where you've deviated from what your budget was, and anticipating and understanding impacts going forward. So, planning out those scenarios and seeing what your expenses might look like. It's absolutely critical that you begin to document everything related to coronavirus if you haven't already. And while many expenses are likely to be reimbursed, documenting them is critical. This goes well beyond simply tracking receipts. It's tracking staff labor and travel time on time cards, equipment expenses with their justified need, facility where they were used, management expenses, including housing, food, and fuel, for example, are likely to be reimbursable with the right documentation. So while processes are in place to fast track emergency funding, it's likely that retroactive requests for more documentation and information will be required down the road. So for having that documentation readily available to support any reimbursement claims you've made will be very important going forward. Also, leaving aside the CARES Act and the funding that came from that or through that, documenting expenses now can help you prepare for the future and future grant funding. So programs that maybe have not received that much money yet or have not been tapped, it's possible that they will going forward, and having that documentation, you may find that you had eligible expenses that you can submit for reimbursement. So you want to work to make sure that all of your staff understand the importance of documentation and that clear procedures are in place. Because you're going to need to demonstrate that you spend the right money on the right things during the right time frame. So it's certainly better to document more rather than less to maximize your reimbursement potential. And again, it's all related to what is eligible. So having a firm understanding of eligibility is key. And we have a lot of experts that spend quite a bit of time understanding the guidelines and how to stay on the right side of eligibility. Preparing for tomorrow, all in the spirit of quick response, relief, and recovery. We expect the themes around tapping existing programs, streamlining administration, and increased flexibility in funding program management. They'll carry forward in all future legislation, but with an increasing emphasis on longer term impact, and we certainly hope so. And infrastructure and economic development fall into that category. I think we can expect additional bills to target the impacts of coronavirus while helping to protect human health and jumpstart the economy. There'll likely be some atypical projects that are supported, like those that limit exposure to future pandemics and technologies for COVID tracking, maybe supply chain analysis to bring sources closer to major economic hubs, as we've seen some constraints on our economy related to the stay-at-home and social distancing orders. They've highlighted some vulnerabilities. Overarching, again, documentation is really important, and making sure that you're capturing incurred costs today and lining up the appropriate documentation for community projects going forward, so that you have systems in place where information is easy to find and to pull together. If previous economic stimulus is any indication of what's going to happen later this year, we think that construction projects will be a target for federal funding. Construction projects create jobs, job creation is going to be huge, and infrastructure projects have a strong economic multiplier effect. So there are a number of studies that show that if you invest a certain number of dollars into transportation projects, that they have a multiplying effect in terms of the total amount of money that moves through the economy. So a rigorous demonstration of cost estimating helps prove that your project is shovel ready, and a clear quantification of benefits, and those you have to think expansively about benefits. It's benefits to life, safety, disaster risk reduction, there's social considerations, environmental benefits, economic gains, and so when we do this, whenever we're assisting with funding, we try to do this in terms of looking at projects that might be bundled together because they have similarities, projects that may be disassembled because they share particular elements, and by bundling or by disassembling, we align them better with funding program objectives and increase the likelihood of them being selected and awarded funding. So when you're thinking about benefits, it's a good time to think about how you might group projects or how you might take parts of projects to apply for different types of funding. Planning, it may seem counterintuitive when action is so key, but many of these funding programs, even with their easing up of requirements, do require that you have updated plans in place that articulate and justify the need for funding. So for example, if coronavirus has highlighted resilient infrastructure needs and the financial impacts related to COVID-19 necessitate alternative funding sources to deliver projects, and you want to apply to FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities funding program because it's a great fit for your needs, you're going to have an updated hazard mitigation plan to be eligible. Also, HUD's CDBG requires an updated action plan every year, and the five-year consolidated plans. So lastly, today we can take the knowledge that we have of funding programs and their objectives, their goals, our understanding of your capital needs that we can see clearly through using tools like FAMS, and our insights into where the future funding is likely to go. And we can be thinking about matching your needs and different funding programs. And we can come up with a preliminary set of recommendations for funding programs and projects. And then, using FAMS, we can model how likely awards and funding terms, like interest rates, for example, will impact your financial plan. And if the benefits of pursuing the funding are deemed to outweigh the costs, then we start characterizing elements of funding applications, assemble project-related documentation, and do gap analyses to determine immediate steps to prep the project for submission, all in anticipation of notices of funding award and notices of funding availability and notices of funding opportunity, so that you have a funding strategy that is very actionable and that you can expedite when the money becomes available. So that increases your chances of getting the money you need when it becomes available. And while there's still a lot of uncertainty, these best practices that we've seen over decades in terms of funding are still very applicable and can help position you for the money when it does come. So with that, we'd like to get your questions. I'll turn it back over to David for that.
Thank you, Amy and Andy, both for your presentations today. Very, very helpful. As Amy said, we want to open it up to some questions for the audience. A couple of reminders: there are 3 handouts under the little handout drop-down that you can pull off and take a look at. In interest of not having a bunch of folks talk over each other, it might be easiest if you use the chat box and type in a name or a question, and we can call on you to open up and discuss in an orderly way. We also can, certainly be available for questions and much greater detailed dialogue on the subjects after this at any time.
Thanks, David. We have a question from Elizabeth Wells. She's asking, is this affordable, FAMS, for small rural cities, especially those under 15,000 population? If not, is there a way to do a cost share model between a city and county or development authority where we could create our own secure dashboards?
Perfect. Very fair and good question. So the key elements and concerns that we have to address with FAMS are just really relative to size, complexity of the system, and number of users. But we've been able to put FAMS in place pretty successfully for small communities at a rather modest cost. And to the extent that modest is, in the eye of the beholder, there are also ways to do cost sharing between communities. To the extent, for example, there's maybe resiliency projects that would cut across multiple jurisdictional boundaries, notwithstanding the way that technically, water would flow per se for a resiliency type project. So definitely something that we could explore, but usually for a pricing conversation, we need to just have a little bit of discussion about the nature of your systems in terms of, what types of functions you need, your data, number of users, but this is very scalable and making it affordable for really small size communities as well. because a lot of the things that you would want customized, or certain things that maybe others would want are nice to haves for you, maybe not essentials. And so it can absolutely be scaled to fit your budget.
Great, thank you. Another question, can this be used for a utility versus, a city or a county, a general fund? Like, what are the various applications, I guess, of the FAMS system for your particular instance?
Sure. So for the FAM system itself, it really, for a community, it models each of your different either general funds, special revenue funds that you may have, or enterprise funds. So we routinely set them up for general funds, water and sewer utilities, stormwater or drainage systems. We've done beach renourishment funds, building permit funds. It's really a function of, what enterprises, make the most sense so that communities want to have the application set up for. So it's really applicable for any and all of those government services that you offer. And it's really structured around the way you set up your funding in terms of general funds, special revenue funds, or enterprise funds.
Okay, great. Question here on federal procurement. How do federal procurement and compliance requirements play into accessing funding in a timely fashion? Amy, I think that one's probably for you.
That's a good question. It's important right now to follow procurement procedures, federal procurement procedures. Federal, state, and local should all be adhered to, especially when it comes to emergency response funding. You want to make sure that when you're looking for people to help you in delivering emergency response and relief, that costs are reasonable. You can't use cost plus contracts; they're not eligible. They're piggybacking contracts, for example, need to be reviewed by state territory liaisons or FEMA. And so you do want to keep in mind how to stay on the right side of federal procurement, and then looking at the longer term. If you're incurring project costs currently, you'll want to and hope to apply for and receive funding down the line. You're going to want to put in place some of the requirements on your contractors that are part of federal funding, like Davis-Bacon and American Iron and Steel. Those might be very real requirements for you. And a tool like FAMS can help to understand what the cost implications of those requirements could be on actually delivering your projects effectively. So it is important to take into consideration now, if you'd like to be lined up for future funding, how you're procuring support and materials, and making sure that you're falling on the right side with some of the federal and state guidelines.
Okay, great, thank you. Andy, looks like one has come in for you. Is there a limit to the number of users for FAMS, and are there different levels of access? So I'm assuming, if one department wanted to access a specific portion of the cost modeling, whereas maybe the city manager could see everything.
Sure, another good question. So there's really no limit to the number of users for FAMS. It's really ultimately defining the right number for your community. So for smaller communities, it's generally maybe, one or two individuals. But in some cases, some communities have wanted to expand it to have access for, all department heads, finance and city manager staff, and then even for many of their elected officials. And that works well in the context of being able to have different levels of access. So we do have administrative users that can control a lot more of the details. So this might be, your finance director person that's kind of the custodian of FAMS that maybe wants to have access to and control some of the core model assumptions about inflation rates or other things. But for kind of executive users that really just want to be able to look at high level impacts, make some of the key adjustments that I was demonstrating today, they maybe don't necessarily need to see the core assumptions or have access to those. So there absolutely can be different defined levels of access for different types of users as part of the process. It's, again, part of the customization for each community that we go through.
Great. Another question's come in here. This one's from Donna. She's wondering, from a reimbursable standpoint, probably a good one for Amy, can time spent on conference calls concerning the crisis be used as reimbursable? And thankfully, she said her community is primarily affected by inconvenience. So that's great, Donna.
I would have to look at the specifics, but from a a high level, yes, I believe these are costs you're incurring that are unexpected and directly attributable to the coronavirus. So that should be accountable. This would fall under the category of management's time and expenses. And if that is, if the key is, does that cost more? Is your time, where are you, how can you track that down to a quantifiable impact? But I'm happy to, if you have more specifics on that, I'm happy to look into it and provide you guidance.
Yeah, and we'll follow up with everyone that registered using the email address that you provided with a recording of the presentation where you can access that, and the handouts, and the panelists' email addresses and phone numbers and such if you'd like to follow up, obviously. So if you'd like more information on that, Don or anyone else, you can follow up accordingly. All right, if there's no more questions in the question box, we have a few minutes left. Everyone is able to unmute themselves if they're interested. If you have any comments, or if you would like to maybe just provide some experience that your community is going through that might benefit others, we thought just to share might be nice if you're comfortable, and if not, that's all right as well. We'll give you a few minutes back. Okay, looks like another question actually came in. If a community were to work with you on the FAMS model, is your funding team part of the package?
They absolutely could be. So it's a matter of, again, what type of support you're looking for. So a lot of what we do is not just about tools like FAMS. It's also about leveraging our experience with other communities and helping provide some advice, whether it's on financial policies, developing scenarios, or evaluating your funding options. And so any and all of that, could be available to you as part of the process. If it's of interest, and for those that it may not be, that's okay too. We're just really trying to help as best we can with our tools and our experiences. So both can absolutely be part of the conversation.
Great, thank you. All right, final call for questions or comments, and if not, we'll wrap it up and send you on your way. Okay, I think we're good. Well, everybody, thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. Again, we'll follow up with recording and the handouts and such. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you,
everyone.
Good day, everyone.
Thank you.